Welcome to Rebel Speak and Be Encouraged. Today I am reflecting on Isaiah 24. It just came to me while I was praying, and I want to talk about being faithful and righteous in the midst of very hard times and moments in history where chaos seems to be ensuing or winning, or we can feel the chaos. And Isaiah 24 is kind of an image of God bringing a closure to the age, and how God handles the vanity and pride both of fallen angels that have chosen to try to find their authority and power on earth, and powers and principalities of the earth as well, that rulers that oppress, right, tyrants, tyrannical leadership. So this is part of what's being addressed here in Isaiah 24. And I want to read through it today, and my encouragement is what it's like when we're the remnant, those that are holding on to righteousness. And I also, another encouragement is we're going to see a contrast of callings. And I believe this is very important right now, that it's very easy to self-referentially think about our own gifting and expect others' gifting to look like ours. And what happens in a season full of chaos is different gifts get called out. And we're meant to be evangelists of our gifting. We're meant to be out there proclaiming what God would have us proclaim. And sometimes those things kind of bump into other giftings. And there's a way that we can be arrogant versus honoring. And the New Testament won't go into it now, but there's a great argument, just the interactions between Peter and James and Paul. We see honoring versus kind of arrogance, and where there's real tensions, and where my calling and your calling seemingly are in tension with each other, and ways we can honor in the midst of that. So I want to talk about that as well in this Isaiah chapter 24, of just encouraging us in this season of this intensity. It's intensity, calling forth. And I'm going to start here. The earth dries up, the crops wither, the skies refuse to rain. The earth suffers for the sins of its people. So we see this very organic, holistic image of the whole of the earth suffering, for they have twisted the instructions of God. That's an amazing. They've twisted the instructions of God, violated his laws, and broken his everlasting covenant. And of course, this is speaking specifically to Israel, and I believe at this point to Judah, but it also might be referencing the northern kingdom. But there's a way that it's true. Humanity is guilty of this as well. Humanity twists God's instruction and violates his laws and breaks his everlasting covenant. And therefore, this being not in right relationship. So this isn't just behavior modification, that God comes in and God insists on God's way and then kind of forces God's hand through power and authority. It's much more organic than that, as I read this. That there's a way that the world in its insistence, and especially the powers at play, that lure people into wrong think and wrong living, that it results. The earth can't handle the sin. The weight of the sin is crushing. Okay. Let me see. Therefore, a curse consumes the earth and its people. They are left desolate, destroyed by fire. Few will be left alive. So there's this day that is being looked, there's a day to come. But I feel that there's many of these days. Like there's times in history where the powers, the authority of violence, of evil, comes into contact with a praying church and a praying people and righteousness. And in the midst of that, there's kind of these throes. There's this tension. And I believe that many of us are discerning extreme tension. We're in the midst of powers and principalities bumping into each other, and the kingdom of darkness, right, engaging with the kingdom of light, or I should probably say the kingdom of light engaging with the kingdom of darkness. But it's a moment in time of great consequence. All the joys of life will be gone. The grape harvest will fail, and there will be no wine. And wine is this imagery of joy in the midst of life, right? In the midst of life. That the goodness of God and the fingerprints of God's goodness are so strong on earth that in the midst of incredible leanness and suffering, human beauty, sweetness and goodness persevere in the midst of harsh circumstances. And there's a time, though, when Scripture here is imagining that there is no wine, there's no lightness, there's no joy to be found. Heaviness and oppression are the normative. The merrymakers will sigh and mourn. The clash of tambourines will be still. The happy cries of celebration will be heard no more. An absence of joy, an absence of life. I think meaning as we know it, meaning as we know existence and goodness. This world that God at its creation said it is good. There's this absence there. The melodious chords of the harp will be silent. Gone are the joys of wine and song. Strong drink now turns bitter in the mouth. And so there's this organic beauty of life, melody and song, and then there's even like, okay, I'm going to turn to strong drink. Things are hard, so I'm going to even get drunk, and even that can't save you. It's a moment in time when the goodness of the earth isn't there to buoy you up. Things are hard and difficult. The city the city writhes in chaos. Every home is locked to keep out looters. This whole understanding of chaos and how God at creation put order upon the earth. That there's no more order. Things are upside down, they're not right. Mobs gather in the streets, crying out for wine, crying out for this goodness, looking for some light. Joy has reached its lowest ebb. Gladness has been banished from the land. And I just want to get this sense that there's, in the midst of how hard life is, gladness and joy are still normative. And then there comes a time when joy and gladness can't be found. And the ways that we've known how to get joy and gladness, even the cynical, like let's get drunk, none of that is working. The city is left in ruins with its gates battered down. There's been a loss. There's been a defeat. The city is no more. Throughout the earth, the story is the same. This is what Isaiah 24 is looking at, a time when the whole of the earth falls to this situation. Like the stray olives left on the tree or the few grapes left on the vine after harvest, only a remnant is left. And this is, to me, as a Christian, fascinating. That here in Isaiah, they're looking to a time when the world is writhing. Something's being disestablished. The way that humanity's kind of kept on working, it's no longer working. But in that moment, there's this remnant. It's a few. It's a few. It's a remnant. It's less than a minority. It's a remnant. And it's going to talk a little bit about that remnant right now. But all who are left, this remnant, the olives that weren't gleaned, the grapes that weren't picked, the few, in the midst of this few, all who are left will shout and sing for joy. So there's the city and it's writhing for an absence of joy. And then there's this few, this remnant, those of us who know that are living in the midst of Christ and fulfillment and goodness. There's this joy for they. Those in the West, and I want you to see it's widespread. He's going to reference the West and the South. He's going to reference the coastlands. That there's this way that this remnant, though few, are found everywhere. They're found everywhere, and they're fully alive, and they're fully rejoicing, and they're fully dancing, and they're fully celebrating. Okay, those in the West will praise the Lord Yahweh's majesty. In eastern lands, give glory to Yahweh. In the coastlands of the sea that's far away, outreach, the forgotten, oh wow, praise the name of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Listen to them as they sing to Yahweh from the ends of the earth. Hear them singing praises, wow, to the righteous one. So in this season of intensity and tension, There are those that are dancing and praising, the remnant that are bringing and are aware of and are in the midst of the fullness of God's goodness and glory. All right, there are those. And then we're going to see Isaiah. There's this juxtaposition. That's kind of what I'm reaching for here. But my heart is heavy with grief. Here's Isaiah, the prophet, who has a word to the people, who's trying to turn the heart yet of the people. To me, these are different gifts. There are those that are in the fullness right now, in the midst of all that's kind of crazy and difficult, that are just dancing in the joy of God's goodness. They're celebrating. They're saying, no, the reality of God is so good. It's so good. There's nowhere that it's not good. That the presence, right? Presence is real. Presence is abundance. I want to say presence is just delightful. There are those that are dancing. And then here Isaiah, he can see the remnant, but his heart is heavy. In this time of righteousness meeting evil powers and evil rulers, there are some that say like, wow, no, I can feel God's goodness. I'm dancing and I'm delighting and I'm in joy. And some can look at that and say, something's false about that, excuse me. Nothing's false about that. That's the gifting. That's where they live. And they're meant to be singing and shouting and praising. And they probably have a tendency to say, why are you worried? Everything's good. God's not dead. I remember that amazing story of Martin Luther's wife one day dressing, and he really, had struggles with depression and just being discouraged. And one day she dresses like she's in mourning, and he's like, well, what's wrong with you? And she said, oh, haven't you heard God's, I don't think she said God's dead, but something's awful. And he's like, no, it's good. And then she turns the table on him, and then, why are you living that way, right? And like sometimes the folks can look and say, you should be rejoicing. And we know that Isaiah in this context knows. He's speaking the remnant. He knows the celebration, but he says that, no, my heart is heavy with grief. I am discouraged, for evil still prevails. See, Isaiah is looking out, and there is the remnant that knows the goodness, that knows the sweetness, that is honoring God. However you picture the remnant in the midst of Isaiah 24. We as remnant followers, as those, the joyous ones of Christ. Okay. But here's Isaiah, and his heart is grieving for the times he's in. And there's some of us who are grieving for the times. And God, like there's just this thing in our heart, we can feel it, right? Where the hovering of the Spirit upon our heart, we're in grief. He says, for evil still prevails and treachery is everywhere. Traps and snares will be your lot, you people of this earth. He's feeling the weight of their sin. He can see it. Those who flee in terror will fall into a trap, and those who escape the trap will step into a snare. There's an inevitability of God bringing to an end their rebellion. There's an inevitability, and Isaiah feels that. He feels that weight, and he feels that consequence. Okay. In that day, destruction falls on you from the heavens. See, Isaiah knows it's inescapable. God is confronting evil. That right now, I believe we are in the midst of a time where God himself is confronting evil. And for some, it's so joyous and so exciting. And for others, it's, right, there's a call on your life that's saying, God, how do we help? How do I help people see? How do I speak into this kind of deranged reality, truth? How do I get truth to people that sets people free in the midst of this moment in time? The world is shaken beneath you. The earth has broken down and is utterly collapsed. Everything is lost, abandoned, and confused. The earth staggers like a drunkard. It trembles like a storm, like in a tent in a storm. Okay, these are nomadic people. They know what can happen to a tent in a storm. How quickly, and the vulnerability of the earth. that without God's presence, without God's protection, in this moment of encounter, the earth is so vulnerable. It falls and will not rise again, for its sins are very great. And I just wanted to touch on how Isaiah, in his call as prophet, speaking to the people, beckoning them yet into righteousness, watching their stubbornness, watching their sin, is on a very different page than the remnant that's rejoicing. His heart is grieved. Some of us some of us are just in there praying, maybe called interceding, just praying, feeling a burden. Others are laughing and rejoicing. They're not in tension with each other. It's not a real tension. It's gifting, and we honor. Thank goodness there are those that delight in. Thank goodness there are those who are grieved in their spirit and crying out on behalf of those who are lost. Saying, God, make this right. Establish your justice in the land. Something's so very wrong here, God. Something's so very wrong. In your mercy, act, God. In your mercy, move, God. That's in the heart. The different ways that we feel the move of God, and we're created to carry that. And we're responsible to carry what it is we're called to carry. And others might look and say, wow, I don't get it. But we want to be discerning and rejoice. Rejoice at what another is carrying, what their actions are bringing to birth. In that day, Yahweh will punish the fallen angels in the heavens and the proud rulers of the nations of the earth. This is a great day that Isaiah is looking to. But I do want to say, throughout history, God has taken on when the fallen angels, when God has taken on the way the rulers of earth, the proud and the arrogant, can work with, right, powers, angels that are seeking authority and power here on earth. And my language is awkward because I don't know much about it. But there's collusion, right? Collusion between the powers and principalities of these fallen angels, that power and principality, and the powers and principalities that run nations, right? That have authority in human life directly. There's collusion between them. And God, in his infinite grace, throughout history, again and again and again and again and again, has brought down powers that thought they had, right, that they'd arrived, that they were never going to go anywhere, that they were the greatest of all time, where they end up worshiping themselves. They're drunk with their own delusion of grandeur. They're drunk with it. And so even though this is speaking, there's an ultimate time when this is ultimately and forever no more put to an end. I believe that we're in the midst of great covetousness of power. Evil, covetousness of power. God's dealing with it. Bringing it, sobering it up, bringing it to light, having it be seen by all. They will be rounded up and put in prison until they are tried and condemned. Then Yahweh Almighty will mount his throne, and this is the day I can't wait for, on Mount Zion. He will rule gloriously in Jerusalem, in the sight of all the leaders of his people. Leadership will be 100% pure and good, and for the fullness of human worth. That's good leadership. Good leadership establishes a flourishing of humanity. Each person made in God's image flourishing as and who they are. There will be such glory that the brightness of the sun and moon will seem to fade away. Today, my be encouraged is that wherever you are in the midst of this, to me, very intense season, we're all over the globe. Things are being set right by God. God is dealing with entrenched sin. Sin that thought it was so well hidden. Sin that was behaving so badly. It was whispering to itself in the night, words of victory. And God's just pulling, there's that expression, but I see it so much in prayer. That's what I see, just the pulling off of masks, the lies being seen fully for what they are. Lies that thought they could destroy livelihoods. Lies that thought they could converge more power, right? Pool more power together. Lies that believed themselves, believed their own righteousness as they were destroying livelihoods of others and pulling more and more power, gathering power. That's what evil does. It gathers power unto itself at the expense of others. And there's a great reckoning we're in the midst of. And there are some that are that remnant that are just running around in joy and delight. And they're not superficial. I've heard people say, wow, if you're not suffering, then you're not really following Jesus because Scripture says you'll suffer. But it's just not all that Scripture says. It's just not all that it says. There's this remnant that's able to walk in God's goodness and grace. But just because there's others that you can feel, like for me, I just feel intensity. I feel intensity and I know God's with it. I know that God's with me. And I know I can feel laughter and I can feel victory and I can feel joy and I can feel weeping and I know God's goodness. But there is an intensity of what something's been staged and God's outstaged it. There was this thing that was staged and it thought every piece was perfect for its ultimate takeover, and unbeknownst to it, underneath it, God had staged a great revealing. And we're in the midst of the great revealing of our great God, where lies are being revealed. There's a song that I've mentioned because I'm singing it all the time. Lives be healed, chains be broken, lives be healed. And I think it's God be revealed, but I don't know. But I know this word reveal. We talk about like gender reveal. Like there's this great reveal that's happening. And we're all players. God's put different burdens on each of us that we, as we're faithful to that, as we're faithful to the call, as we're faithful to what God's speaking to us, as we're faithful, some to fasting and some to dancing, and they're not intention. It's God's delight to have such extreme diversity in the kingdom. We're not, really be careful what you say about a brother and sister who walk a little different. I'm going to say Rechabites. I might say it wrong. The Rechabites were lifted up for their righteousness in the book of Isaiah, and they didn't drink wine. And I'm pretty sure they might not have cut their hair, and they didn't buy houses, I'm pretty sure. But I can mix stories up. But I know at one point they're pointed out for their righteousness, and they lived rather oddly, and they were faithful to that call. And wherever you are, wherever God has you right now, if there are voices mocking you or tearing you down or saying something's wrong with you, know that you're under the umbrella of God's love, and know that you will not know disappointment. However heavy the time is feeling for you right now, however oppressive, like there's something about some of us standing up in righteousness in the midst of the weight of oppression. And it's not false. You haven't put it on yourself. You're not doing something wrong, that this is the narrative. It's not a narrative. This is the reality that you're in the midst of. Find brothers and sisters. And I feel compelled to pray for you and to cheer you on and to rejoice for you. And I'm like, wow, I just keep saying the same thing because I feel compelled to say it, that you're fighting the good fight and you're going to reap a beautiful crop of deliverance in the land. That you're living what you're living with the weight of what you're feeling unto beautiful, good, and righteous true ends. Salvation, your righteousness in the midst of your journey right now is bringing forth salvation into the land. Invite that goodness, invite that authority. If you feel like the enemy's crushing you, find a brother and sister, join hands, sing a song. Today, my husband and I, things were so heavy, and it was, you could just say this is ridiculous, but it wasn't. It was what it was. And we just, I don't even remember what song, an older song, and we just started singing, we worship you. And I won't sing it because I don't sing well, but we were both just singing it, and you could just feel God's glory in the midst of so much having gone wrong, in the midst where you're just fighting for that rightness, right? We're just lifting that image, and we're just saying, okay, this is it. This is it. God's goodness in the land of the living. This is it. And I worship you. Anyway, we're just singing it, and I could just feel God's glory breaking through. But I have to be determined. I have to be determined. And that's why I am spending my time just speaking to, inviting you where you are in your journey, inviting you to know God's goodness, inviting you to raise your hands and delight in God's faithfulness, and to determine to say, nope, I'm not going to curse like Job. I don't care what's going on right now. Not cursing it. I'm inviting God's goodness, because the nature and the character of God is that when God shows up, everything is not only put right, but worthwhile. Not only put right, but worthwhile. Be encouraged.